The New Year Honours 1979 were appointments in many of the Commonwealth realms of Queen Elizabeth II to various orders and honours to reward and highlight good works by citizens of those countries. They were announced on the 1st of January 1979 to celebrate the year past and mark the beginning of 1979. Names and titles of recipients are shown as they appeared in this honours list. United Kingdom. Knight Bachelor Peter Coleman Boone, lately Chairman, Hoover Limited. For services to export. Lawrence Boyle, Chief Executive, Strathclyde Regional Council. John Keyworth Boynton, MC, Chief Executive, Cheshire County Council. Derek Holdham Brown, Vice Chairman, Allied Breeze Limited. Eugene Cross M.B.E.M.M. for Public Service in Wales. Alistair Robert Curry, Professor of Pathology, University of Edinburgh. Professor William Empson, for services to English literature. Moses I. Finlay, Professor of Ancient History, University of Cambridge. Isaac Hyde Jacob, Q.C., Senior Master of the Supreme Court and Queen's Remembrancer. Brian Smith Kellett, Chairman, Tube Investments Limited. John Leonard King, Chairman, Babcock & Amp Wilcox Limited. For services to export. Eric John Ewan-Law, Judge of the Court of Appeal, Kenya. Alan Charles McLaurin Mokaris, C.B.E. Conductor. Kenneth Mather, C.B.E. Professor of Genetics, University of Birmingham. Frederick William Page, C.B.E. Chairman and Chief Executive, Aircraft Group, British Aerospace. John Joseph Joffre Page, O.B.E. Chairman, National Ports Council. William Drummond MacDonald Patton, C.B.E. Professor of Pharmacology, University of Oxford. James Redmond, lately Director of Engineering, British Broadcasting Corporation. Bernard Francis William Scott, C.B.E. TD, Chairman, Lucas Industries Limited. For services to export. Walter Stansfeld, C.B.E. M.C.Q. P.M. C.P.M. Chief Constable, Derbyshire Constabulary. John Nicholas Walton, T.D., Professor of Neurology and Dean of Medicine, University of Newcastle upon Tyne. Professor John Crossley Wood, C.B.E. Chairman, Central Arbitration Committee. State of Victoria. The Honourable Mr. Justice George Herman Lush, of Canterbury, for distinguished service to the law. Mr. Oscar Gwyn Meyer, O.B.E.D., of Toorak, for distinguished service to the State of Victoria. State of Queensland. The Honourable William Edward Knox, M.L.A., Deputy Premier and Treasurer. Robert Lindley Sparks, of Jandaway, for distinguished services to the state and to local government. State of Western Australia. Bruce McKinley, C.B.E. of Dalkeith, for services as President, Confederation of Western Australian Industry and also to the community. Order of the Bath. Knight Grand Cross of the Order of the Bath. General Sir Edwin Bramall, K.C.B.O. B.E.M.C. Colonel Commandant 3rd Battalion The Royal Green Jackets. Colonel 2nd King Edward VII Throne Gurkha Rifles. Sir Ian Powell Bancroft, K.C.B. Head of the Home Civil Service. Knight Commander of the Order of the Bath. Vice Admiral Peter Egerton Capelberger, M.V.O.D. S.C. Vice Admiral James Henry Fuller Aberle. Lieutenant General Robin MacDonald Carnegie, O.B.E. late the Queen's Own Hussars. Major General James Michael Gow, late Scots Guards. Colonel Commandant Intelligence Corps. Air Marshal Alan Cyril Davies, C.B.E. Royal Air Force. Acting Air Marshal Keith Alec Williamson, A.F.C. Royal Air Force. Frederick John Atkinson, C.B. Chief Economic Advisor, H.M. Treasury. John Wilfred Bourne, C.B. Clerk of the Crown in Chancery and Permanent Secretary, Lord Chancellor's Office. Thomas Chalmers Hetherington, C.B. BETD, QC, Director of Public Prosecutions. Major Sir James Rennie Maudsley, K. CVOM, BE, Keeper of the Privy Purse and Treasurer to the Queen. Companion of the Order of the Bath. Military Division Rear Admiral Thomas Henry Bradbury. Rear Admiral John Roger Southey Gerard Pierce. Rear Admiral Wilfred Jackson Graham. Rear Admiral Michael Lawrence Stacey. Major General David Stanley Appleby, MCTD, Army Legal Corps. Major General Peter Aldcroft Downward, D. SOD, FC, Colonel the Queen's Lancashire Regiment. Major General Arthur Michael Lancelot Hogg, late the Queen's Own Hussars. Major General Kenneth Saunders, OBE, late Royal Army Pay Corps. Major General Richard Brookingtrand, late Royal Regiment of Artillery. Air Vice Marshal John Bagot Curtis, Royal Air Force. Air Vice Marshal Harry Gill, OBE, Royal Air Force. Air Vice Marshal Peter Turner, Royal Air Force. Air Commodore Hubert Desmond Hall, CBEA, FCA, DC, Royal Air Force. Civil Division Robert John Andrew, Deputy Secretary, Home Office. Alan Jeffrey Beard, Under Secretary, Department of Health and Social Security. Ronald Ernest Baring, Deputy Secretary, Department of Industry. Herbert John Dunster, Deputy Secretary, Health and Safety Executive. Michael David Milroy Franklin, C.M.G., Deputy Secretary, Cabinet Office. Eric Frank Hedger, OBE, Under-Secretary, Ministry of Defense. Martin Wyatt Holgate, Director General of Research, Departments of the Environment and Transport. Samuel Frederick Radcliffe Martin, First Legislative Draftsman, Northern Ireland. John Angus Macbeth Mitchell, C.VOMC, Secretary, Scottish Education Department. John Howard Nelson, Deputy Secretary, Ministry of Defence. Anthony Derek Maxwell Oulton, Deputy Secretary, Lord Chancellor's Office. Alexander Brown Patterson, Director, Veterinary Laboratories, Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. Dennis Henry Payne, Principal Director, Ministry of Defence. Miss Lois Audrey Pittam, lately Under-Secretary, Department of Employment. William Sinclair Ryrie, Deputy Secretary, HM Treasury. George Girdwood Stewart, MCTD, Commissioner, Forestry Commission. John William Weston, Principal Assistant Solicitor, Board of Inland Revenue. Richard William Longworth Wilding, Deputy Secretary, Civil Service Department. Stanley David Wilkes, Chief Executive, British Overseas Trade Board, Department of Trade. Order of St. Michael and St. George. Knight Grand Cross of the Order of St. Michael and St. George Sir David Scott, K. CMG, HM Ambassador, South Africa. Knight Commander of the Order of St. Michael and St. George Sir Sam Fowle, K. CVO, C. MG, D. SC, British High Commissioner, Lagos. Stanley James Gunn England, C.M.G., British High Commissioner, Nairobi. Arthur Temple Franks, C.M.G., Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Reginald Alfred Hibbert, C.M.G., Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Arthur John Wilton, C.M.G., M.C.H.M. Ambassador, Jeddah. State of Western Australia, the Honourable Sir Charles Walter Michael Court, OBEM, LA, Premier of Western Australia. Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George Gordon Elliott Myers, Under-Secretary, Ministry of Agriculture, Fisheries and Food. Rupert George Raw, United Kingdom Director, European Investment Bank. Richard John William Rees, Head of Laboratory for Leprosy and Mycobacterial Research, National Institute for Medical Research. Ian James Shaw, OBE, Under-Secretary, Ministry of Defence. Charles Leonard Booth, M.VOHM Ambassador, Rangoon. Sydney John Guy Cambridge, H.M. Ambassador, Kuwait; Alan Ewan Donald, HM Ambassador, Kinshasa; George Ferguson Finlayson, British Consul General, Toronto; Bertram Anthony Flack, British Deputy High Commissioner, Ottawa; Brian Hutchinson, Government Communications Headquarters; Derek John Claremont Jones, Secretary for the Environment, Hong Kong; John William Dennis Margetson, HM Ambassador, Hanoi; Peter James Scott Moon, British High Commissioner, Dar es Salaam; John Anthony Benedict Stewart, OBE, HM Ambassador, Vientiane; Andrew Christopher Stewart, CPM, lately Consul at HM Embassy, Jakarta; Reginald Robert Temple, Foreign and Commonwealth Office; Reginald James Wallace, OBE, Governor, Gilbert Islands; Joe Boothwright, lately HM Ambassador, Abidjan; State of New South Wales Keith Ransom Garlin, for service to medicine and the community. State of Queensland Leo John Williams, of Hamilton, for services to the community. State of Western Australia Gordon Barrett-Hill, of Claremont, for services to the profession of engineering. Royal Victorian Order, Knight Grand Cross of the Royal Victorian Order the Right Honourable Simon, Earl of Dalhousie, KT.BEM.C. Knight Commander of the Royal Victorian Order Alfred Lapthorne Blake, C.VOM.C. The Reverend Canon James Seymour Dennis Mansell, M.VO. Sir Peter Malden Stud, B.E. Commander of the Royal Victorian Order Miss Marjorie Grace Blackie, Vice Admiral Sir Ronald Vernon Brockman, K.C.B.C. S.I.C. I.E.C. B.E. William John Chalmers, C.B.C. B.E. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Colin Cole, M.VO. T.D. Roger Ivan Mutimer, M.VO. The Right Honourable James Wogan, Baron Remnant; Russell Dillonwood, M.VO. V.R.D. Member of the Royal Victorian Order Miss Carol Elizabeth Barrington Haynes; Geoffrey Gowan Collins; Christopher Gordon Llewellyn Corey; Major Robert Anthony Gordon Courage, M.B.E. Grenadier Guards; Chief Superintendent Stanley Critchlow, Metropolitan Police; Lieutenant Commander Oswald Manuel Blaxland de las Casas, O.B.E. Royal Navy; Martin Hines; Surgeon Commander David Askey Lamyman, Royal Navy; Captain Michael Henry Tyndall Mellish, O.B.E. R.D. Frank Ronald Mintram; Jane, Mrs. Napier; Surgeon Lieutenant Commander Peter Huntley Robinson, Royal New Zealand Navy; Nigel Vinson; Commander Leslie Frederick John Walker, Q.P.M. Metropolitan Police; Peter Wilson; Keith Alexander Evans; Stella Elizabeth Lewis Mrs. Marks; Miss Edith Victoria Martin; Miss Laura Joan Maxey; Miss Claudia Ann Wyndham Payne; Leonard George Perkins; Alan Neil Stimson; William Morgan Taylor. Royal Victorian Medal Yeoman Bedgoer Charles Blackmore, Her Majesty's Bodyguard of the Yeoman of the Guard; Rosemary, Mrs. Crowe; James Forbes; Miss Mary Kenny; Harry Eric Pashley; Chief Petty Officer Stuart John Stuart Rhodes; Ronald Charles Russell; William Eric Wickett; Chief Marine Engineering Mechanic James Taylor Whiteman. Order of the British Empire, Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire Elizabeth, Mrs. Coker, Chairman, Executive Council, Association of County Councils, for Public Service, Miss Gracie Fields, C.B.E. Entertainer, Naomi Christine, Mrs. James, for services to sailing. Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire Major General Roy Michael Frederick Redgrave, M.C., late the Royal Horse Guards; Air Marshal Geoffrey Harold Ford, C.B., Royal Air Force; Robert Hillkidd, C.B., Head of Northern Ireland Civil Service; Jack Cater, C.B.E., Chief Secretary, Hong Kong; New Zealand. Knight Bachelor Joseph Holmes Miller OBE, of Wellington, for services to the Ross Dependency, Conservation and Surveying. Robertson Huntley Stewart CBE, of Christchurch, for services to manufacturing and community. Order of the Bath. Companion of the Order of the Bath Military Division Air Vice Marshal Cyril Lawrence Seagate CBE MVODFCAFC Royal New Zealand Air Force. Order of St. Michael and St. George. Companion of the Order of St. Michael and St. George Donald William Bain MBE, of Christchurch, for services to education. The Honourable John Raymond Mills, of Auckland, for services as a Crown Solicitor. The Most Reverend John Hubert Macy Rogers ADM, of Papatoetoe, for services as Roman Catholic Bishop in Tonga and the Cook Islands. Order of the British Empire. Knight Commander of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division Mr. Justice Gavin John Dunn, Chief Justice of the High Court of the Cook Islands and Chief Justice of Niue. Hepi Hawani Te Heu of Taumarunui, for services to the Maori people and community. Commander of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division James Luke Hazlitt, of Winton, for public services. Ernest Mervyn Hall Kemp MBE, of Wellington, for services to local government. Sidney Lewis Moses, of Wellington, for services to commerce and the community. James McLaren Ritchie, of Dunedin, for services to business, educational, charitable and Anglican church affairs. Peter Jensen Reed Skellerup, for services to the City of Christchurch. Lawrence Houghton Stevens, of Auckland, for services to the textile industry. Officer of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division Hardy Seymour Benton, of Karponga, Taranaki, for services to the dairy industry. Alan Francis Breesman, of Mosgiel, for services to the National Band of New Zealand. Henry Harford Buswell, Chief Executive Auckland Hospital Board. Thomas Searle Ellingham, of Havelock North, for services to the farming industry. John Norman Stewart Flett, of Auckland, for services to bowling. Peter Townshend Gifford, of Hastings, for services to birthright and the community. Dr. Thomas Edwin Hall, of Christchurch, lately Medical Superintendent, Sunnyside Hospital. Dr. Paul Peter Heller, of Auckland, for services to air and space law. Dr. Dennis Douglas McCarthy, of Auckland, for services to medicine and the community. James Henry Mackenzie, of Hamilton, for services to opera and the community. Robert Alexander Milne, of Christchurch, for services to hockey. John Edward Rolls, of Honolulu, Hawaii, for services to entertainment and New Zealand interests in the USA. Archibald James Scott, of Christchurch, for services to the community. Leonard Alfred C. Sam, of Whakatane, for services to farming, commerce and the community. Alan David Talbot, of South Canterbury, for services to local government. Sidney Ivan Wheatley, of Hamilton, for services to trade union and community affairs. William Seeley Wood, of Auckland, for services to medicine and the community. Graham Augustin Dallow, Deputy Assistant Commissioner, New Zealand Police. Military Division Commander Tom Alexander Riddle, Royal New Zealand Navy. Lieutenant Colonel Herbert Owen, Royal New Zealand Army Education Corps. Group Captain Bernard Joseph O'Connor AFC, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Member of the Order of the British Empire Civil Division George Kent Armstrong DSOMC, of Queenstown, for services to the engineering profession. Eric Samuel Ayres JP, of Ashburton, for services to education. Russell William Bond, of Waikanare, for services to journalism and the arts. Cleland James Graham Brass JP, of Invercargill, for services to local body and community affairs. John Reginald Burford, of Palmerston North, for services to exporting. Miss Thelma Patricia Burton of Lower Hutt, for services to nursing. Robert Tertius Douglas of Wanganui, lately Chief Chemical Inspector, Department of Health. James Jeffrey Furness MC of Blenheim, for services to the community. Miss Gladys Louise Gardner of Auckland, lately Headmistress, Auckland Girls Grammar School. Sholto Hamilton Georgeson of Christchurch, for services to aeronautics. Graham Frederick Glaister of Auckland, for services to exporting. Richie Donald Mast of Raumati Beach, for services to quarrying. Harold Ashworth Holmes JP of Rotorua, for services to the community. Harry Tilson Kershaw of Martinborough, for services to local body and community affairs. Robert Hugh Wither-Curtin of Warkwill, for services to the dairy industry. John Harold Lucas of Wellington, for services to scouting. James Edward Milner of Christchurch, for services to paraplegics. Stanley Guy Russell JP of Raglan, for services to the community. Morris Barrington Smythe of Waikanare, for services to racing. Lincoln Francis Warren of Auckland, for services to rugby. Charles Edward Catlow Webb of Leven, for services to the farming industry and the community. Max Philip Watman of Christchurch, for services to journalism and the community. Mrs. Elsie Hammer Wilkie of Matamata, for services to bowling. Harold Robert Williams of New Plymouth, for services to oil and gas exploration and development in New Zealand. Military Division Warrant Officer Seaman Bertram Cairo McLean, Royal New Zealand Navy. Lieutenant Commander Albert Francis Prendergast, Royal New Zealand Navy. Major Andrew Anderson, Royal New Zealand Engineers. Temporary Major James Tarr, Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. Warrant Officer Class 1 Lawrence Melville Taylor Behm, Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment. Warrant Officer Francis Derrick Bailey, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Squadron Leader Henry Cecil Richardson, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Queen's Service Order Companion of the Queen's Service Order for Community Service Mrs. Joyce Doreen Flynn of Wanganui. Eric Harold Grocott JP of Long Bay, Coromandel. James Earl Hunt of Palmerston North. Chumokai Katipa of Naruawahia. Mrs. Olive Margaret MacLeod Manning of Auckland. Companion of the Queen's Service Order for Public Services Neville Robert Ainsworth of Wellington. General Manager, State Insurance Office. John Mokonuiararangi Bennett of Havelock North. Chairman, Maori Education Foundation. Edward George Buckton of Lower Hutt, lately Principal Private Secretary to the Prime Minister. Dr. David Gordon Edgar of Hamilton, lately Director, Ruakura Animal Research Station, Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries. Trevor Freeman Horn JP of Nelson. Rex Thomas Morpeth JP, Mayor of Whakatane. Patrick George Sheehan JP, Mayor of Devonport. Joseph Leslie Terry JP of Pahiatua. Queen's Service Medal for Community Service Thomas Willie Abbott JP of Papatoetoe. Miss Margaret Brenda Dillon Bell of Palmerston. The Reverend David Howard Verricabinden of Auckland. Mrs. Joyce Winifred Brown of Wellington. Mrs. Stella Adelaide Brown of Auckland. Sidney Charles Burton of Auckland. Mrs. Rachel Chisholm of Blenheim. Morris Walter Maury Church of Porira East. Mrs. Beatrice Mary Clifford of Hamilton. Mrs. Beatrice May Cousins of Waitahuna. Mrs. Mariana Kingy Davis of Bay of Plenty. Louis Rogers Fox of Titahi Bay. Cecil Henry Hilton of Rotorua. Clifford Holdsworth of Christchurch. Miss Winifred Edith Georgina Knight of Hawera. William Morland Limpis JP of Auckland. Mrs. Joan Anita Little of Tokoroa. Mrs. Maisie McNair of Christchurch. Mrs. Clarice Mary May of Winton. Mrs. Nancy Elizabeth Money of Auckland, Mrs. Marjorie Catherine Ogg of Whanganui, John Edward Ord of Taumarunui, Mrs. Florence Gertrude Roberts of Christchurch, Mrs. Rosa Olga Sansom of Gore, Mrs. Elizabeth Mary Wheeler Shaw of Ashburton, Miss Anne Gladys Smith of Dunedin, Mrs. Jean Warren of Christchurch, Mrs. Evelyn Grace Williams J.P. of Kaitaia, Mrs. Margaret Mary Young of Invercargill. Queen's Service Medal for Public Services Mrs. Mary Armstrong of Waimongaroa Postmistress New Zealand Post Office, Herbert William Beasley of Auckland, Miss Lettice Marion Causby of Northland, Cecil Charles Day of Whanganui, Ronald Daniel Eastwood of Te Aroha, Mrs. Phoebe Mildred Frost of Wellington, Charles Anthony Gallagher of South Canterbury, James Benjamin Graham J.P. of Christchurch, Eric William King of Nelson, Miss Lilia Mabel Langridge of Ashburton, Leonard Joseph Flanagan J.P. of Auckland, Alistair Park MacDonald of Whakatane, John William McIntosh J.P. of Waiheke Island, Mrs. Sheila Rossley Maxwell of Gisborne, Miss Tui Alfreda Mayo of Fielding, Mrs. Kathleen Patricia Redmond of Whangarei, Chief Nursing Officer, Northland Hospital Board, Ole Eligard Sorensen of Lower Hutt, lately Assistant Director, Ministry of Agriculture and Fisheries, Mrs. Florence Alice Vincent J.P. of Wellington, Fred John Williams of Gisborne, Kira Williams J.P. of Northland, Harold Alfred Lewis Wright of Martin, lately Head Nurse, Maximum Security Unit, Lake Alice Hospital, Stuart Dudley Belcher, Senior Sergeant, New Zealand Police, Henry Charles Hollander, Constable, New Zealand Police. British Empire Medal Military Division Chief Petty Officer Seaman Anthony David Long, Royal New Zealand Navy, Temporary Chief Petty Officer Seaman Eric Nicholson Vickers, Royal New Zealand Navy, Staff Sergeant William Joseph Donahue, Royal New Zealand Army Service Corps, Temporary Sergeant Alan David Gunderson, Royal New Zealand Infantry Regiment, Staff Sergeant Ronald Hughes, Royal New Zealand Engineers, Temporary Warrant Officer Class 2 Brian Leslie Tolson, Royal New Zealand Signals, Flight Sergeant William Keith Abbott, Royal New Zealand Air Force, Sergeant Raymond Durrick Allen, Royal New Zealand Air Force, Flight Sergeant Roger Langley, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Air Force Cross Squadron Leader Graham James Wharton Goldsmith, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Queen's Fire Service Medal William Clarkson, Fire Force Commander, New Zealand Fire Service, William John Harrison, Senior Station Officer, Invercargill Fire Brigade, Arthur William James Plummer, lately District Officer, Summer Volunteer Fire Brigade, Desmond Morris Robertson, Chief Fire Officer, Waihi Volunteer Fire Brigade, Peter Kenneth Burton Wood, Chief Fire Officer, Director of Fire Safety Division, National Headquarters, New Zealand Fire Service. Queen's Police Medal William Edward Hollands Head, Chief Superintendent, New Zealand Police, Robert Josiah Walton OBE Ed, Commissioner of Police, New Zealand Police.